Sometimes some things happen during the week that lead to a less than upbeat opening. We'll discuss here on the Eric the Red podcast. Hello and welcome everyone to the Eric the Red podcast. I am your host, Eric Beck. Let's go ahead and jump right in here to our weekly wrap-up. And we're going to start with these allegations that came out on Monday against Jeff Gladney, cornerback for your Minnesota Vikings. And as many of us already know now that we're already almost a week after the fact with this news breaking, news broke on Monday that Jeff Gladney had turned himself in to, I believe, Dallas police or somewhere in the Dallas metropolitan area, had turned himself in on what are essentially domestic abuse allegations and charges. And the news broke with a reporter down in the Dallas area, and then it kind of spread very quickly up here in the Twin Cities. And in the aftermath of that, in the media, there was a very quick move and sort of a pretty repeated move over that next 24 hours to denounce these actions, the actions that are alleged against Jeff Gladney, which rightfully so. But there's always a part of me when these things come up that wonders, why is it necessary to continue to say that? It feels like a thing that we should all should be agreed upon just sort of in general immediately. We shouldn't have to, every time something like this happens, feel like we need to continue to say, this is bad. We know that these things are bad. And then continue to use increasingly expressive adjectives, I guess, or to even higher levels of degree in terms of saying how bad something is, moving it towards bad, heinous, and continuing along those lines. Obviously, that is the case, especially with the allegations we are seeing against Jeff Gladney, and with allegations that are seeming to sort of percolate up into the ether of the NFL at this moment, what with the Deshaun Watson case happening down in Houston right now as well. So it is obviously the case, I feel like, that if these allegations are true, and it certainly seems at the moment like there is an incredible amount of truth to what is being alleged, that this is wrong. We need to obviously start there. This is wrong, and then bad, and then we will continue through the process to see where that goes in terms of a legal system standpoint, and then move from there to understanding the football implications for the Vikings. Personally, I am not in a position to be able to comment on legally where this is going to go. My expectations would be Jeff Gladney, if convicted, is facing a 2 to 10 year prison sentence. I would expect a plea deal that brings, if there is jail time, a sentence that is significantly less than that, potentially to the point where you see something like with Malik Beasley's situation with the Timberwolves, which is in the NBA but is also happening in the Twin Cities. Malik Beasley will be serving prison time after the season is over. I would expect there is a possibility, what with Jeff Gladney being an NFL player, that he will be seeing prison time, if at all, during the off season, not something that will affect the regular season play. Which, if we want to move down the path of commenting on that, we can argue whether that is acceptable or not for someone who is in a profession that is more visible and is something that more people are aspiring to, and then has higher expectations. We can discuss the merits of whether it is right or wrong to wait for someone in Jeff Gladney's position to be allowed the time to wait for a prison sentence until after his working season, essentially. I'm not going to do that here right now. That is a broader question that goes beyond just Jeff Gladney. It goes to every other situation that has been seen and will continue to be seen in the NFL as long as actions or offenses are being committed by NFL players. As it stands, with this, to put this in perspective, I think in terms of where the NFL is right now, with with the issue that I just mentioned happening down in Houston with Deshaun Watson, I can't imagine the NFL having any mercy for anyone else at this time along with Deshaun Watson. So I think it is fair to expect that Jeff Gladney will certainly not be playing at the start of this season, potentially for the entirety of this season, and then beyond that may not end up playing with the Vikings again. This could end up being a situation like I believe it was Kareem Hunt. I want to make sure I mix up the two weapons that the Chiefs used to have. I'm going to look this up before I continue down with the wrong name. With Kareem Hunt. The situation with Kareem Hunt where he was in a similar situation, I believe, with domestic abuse issues, and he was cut or released by the Chiefs and then ended up in Cleveland. This could end up being a similar situation because, again, we can argue about the merits of, with this being a football player playing in a very visible league, how his position in terms of effectiveness on the team will dictate what happens with him and consequences that happen with him inside and outside of football. Depending on what goes on with the legal issues, we will probably see whether Jeff Gladney stays with the Vikings or not. This is a discussion that was had with Adrian Peterson and with his issues a number of years ago, I believe 2015. So we will have, will continue to be a wait and see moment in terms of what this will mean in terms of consequences for Jeff Gladney, because as NFL media continues to discuss, and as those of us who watch the NFL know, the NFL has a different standard in terms of proving innocence or guilt when it comes to suspending players. So even if it came out that Jeff Gladney will not be prosecuted by the legal system, we're at a point now where the NFL, I think, will feel it has no choice but to suspend Jeff Gladney, because it certainly seems with the allegations that are happening or that are coming out, something happened with Jeff Gladney and this with a romantic partner, and there will be consequences for Jeff Gladney in the NFL in terms of playing time, whether there are legal consequences or not. So to try to somewhat awkwardly step out of this aspect of this and sort of awkwardly transition over to what does this mean for the Vikings in terms of a football standpoint, coming here now to wrap up the understanding that what has happened is wrong, and we are going to move from that aspect over to just the football side of things now. For the Vikings, it is likely that Gladney doesn't come back this year, may not come back at all, and so you're looking at your cornerbacks and you're saying, what does our cornerback situation look like right now? And it looks like you are still going to be quote-unquote fine if development continues with Cam Dantzler as expected and having signed Patrick Peterson and Mackenzie Alexander already. Mackenzie Alexander, I think people were expecting him to compete for that slot or the starting slot cornerback position with Jeff Gladney. I would imagine now that is just Mackenzie Alexander's, pending whether you bring someone else in, which at this point you would expect if someone is brought in the cornerback room, it will be through the draft here in a couple weeks. So I, for one, I don't want to say glad, or happy, or put some sort of an adjective like that on it, but I do not envy the people who are in a position to have to figure out what is happening there in terms of the Vikings staff. And it is an unenviable position to be in, to try and determine what is happening now as you're waiting for evidence to continue to come out with regards to these allegations. So with that said, we're going to move on now from the Jeff Gladney issues and allegations. We will revisit them if more information comes out, and I will not continue to speculate on anything else that I don't have information about, or that we don't have information about. So that is the Jeff Gladney issues, and we will try to move from that to a bit more of an upbeat sort of continuing to look at what else has happened in the Vikings world this past week and other actions outside of the Vikings specifically that have implications for the Vikings moving forward. So we will move first here to the news that Eric Wilson is now a former linebacker with the Vikings, that he signed with the Philadelphia Eagles on, I believe, a one-year contract worth probably up to $3.25 million, $3.25 million. With the production that Eric Wilson had last season and with the amount of money that he signed for, I am surprised that Eric Wilson is not back with the Vikings. I wonder whether the Vikings decided to move on from Eric Wilson before this contract number was sort of in the ballpark of where Eric Wilson was going to decide to sign, and that they moved in on Nick Vigil before that at a much lower price tag, lower cap hit by roughly $2 million for next season. Because if I understand the cap situation correctly, which is always a question of whether that's true or not, Eric Wilson with this contract would seem to still fit into where the Vikings are right now, unless they're still considering looking for another player at some position who is currently a free agent. So the other, I guess, cautionary tale you could say in terms of if you're wanting to bring Eric Wilson back is knowing what happened with Anthony Harris last year. Anthony Harris 2 seasons ago had a very high level of production, and then last season, coming back on the franchise tag, had a much lower level of production, which we can argue whether or not that is an entire defensive issue or whether that is an Anthony Harris issue. Either way, Anthony Harris is not coming back, and it provided a cautionary tale for the Vikings for what may or may not happen with Eric Wilson moving forward. So that is part, I guess, of the Eric Wilson story. Eric Wilson now moving on from the Vikings, and the Vikings, I guess, feeling at least comfortable enough to not bring him back and to bring another person into the linebacking core or linebacker room. Another thing that happened this week, this may end up being the last thing we talk about here. It is 2 pieces of information that I believe are tied together. The first thing is earlier this week, I do not remember when specifically, I was watching a PFF, Pro Football Focus mock draft on YouTube, which was broadcast on the live stream and then I caught later. That part doesn't matter. The part that matters is that during the stream, during the mock draft, the 2 guys who were picking were going back and forth about who to pick for each position. And then when they got to the Vikings pick at 14, I think it's fair to say, as far as there was emotion involved in this is where the situation devolved in terms of trying to figure out who a team was going to pick. And this was the most emotional, I feel like, either of the guys doing this mock draft was with this Vikings pick. Because the person who got the most emotional was very upset with the Vikings about their offensive line situation. Basically getting to the point where he was saying, I don't care who you take as long as it's an offensive lineman at this pick. So I personally, I think I said this last week, I don't do mock drafts on my own because 1, I don't know college football that well, and then 2, there's so much nebulous possibility about who the team might take, which need to fill, who is going to be available, what's going to be happening before you, and those are things that the team has to figure out and run their own simulations on leading up to the fact. But I think I would rather just watch these things happen from people who know what they're talking about rather than trying to figure them out on my own. That said, I think I have more opinions now as we're getting closer and with other moves that have happened, especially one in particular this week, which was the trade from the Carolina Panthers for Sam Darnold with the New York Jets, or from the New York Jets. Carolina Panthers traded a 6th-round pick this year and then a 2nd and 4th-round pick next year to bring Sam Darnold to the Panthers to, I believe using the word ostensibly here is correct, but for Sam Darnold to ostensibly be the starter in Carolina at quarterback this coming season. And then with that move, there are questions about what will happen with Teddy Bridgewater. People have their own opinions about what may happen with Teddy Bridgewater. But what this says to me, number one, the Panthers are out on Deshaun Watson, which I think is fair to say was going to happen anyways based on Deshaun Watson's own allegations with improper conduct, etc. at all in terms of the Deshaun Watson situation. So Carolina is bringing in Sam Darnold to probably be their quarterback. And what that signals to me is that there is a possibility, and now a very high probability, that the Panthers will not be looking to draft a quarterback at 8. Carolina Panthers still hold on to the number 8 pick. They did not have to trade that pick for Sam Darnold. So they're still in the driver's seat in terms of determining what happens right in the midst of that top 10, or right towards the bottom of the top 10. Now, to tie this in to the PFF mock draft, the trade happened on the same day as the mock draft, but after the mock draft aired. So there was this information wasn't available, so the mock draft had the Panthers drafting a quarterback, I do believe. In either case, whether it did or did not have the Panthers taking a quarterback there, it seems like there is less of a possibility that the Panthers take a quarterback there, which to me provides an interesting sort of piece of information in terms of whether the Vikings are interested in moving up in the draft. There are questions right now about whether the Atlanta Falcons, who have the 4th overall draft pick right now, will be moving off of that pick and moving backwards. It sounds right now like the Falcons are interested in trading that pick if someone is willing to give up enough to move up to 4. Now, this is all a bit complicated without sort of a chart to follow, so I will continue to try and give a word chart in terms of my interest and expectations about what may be happening here in a couple weeks in the draft. The Falcons are currently at 4, and they may or may not have quarterback needs. They may or may not be moving off of their pick. A team that does not have a quarterback need, at least at this point, is picking 5th overall, and that is the Cincinnati Bengals. The Bengals right now are being mocked to either take Penei Sewell, who is an offensive tackle, is expected to be a franchise starting left tackle for an extended period of time moving forward. They are mocked to either take him or to take someone like Jamar Chase or one of these wide receivers. Jamar Chase in particular, I believe, is the wide receiver from LSU. That would reunite him with Joe Burrow, who is currently the quarterback in Cincinnati. They went to college together at LSU. The idea would be to bring them back together to continue to connect and already have a connection moving forward into their pro football careers. Now, the Vikings, we know, have a need on the left side of the offensive line, and Penei Sewell is a person who it would be interesting to see if the Vikings could take. The only way that happens is either to wait for him to fall to you, which probably won't happen, or to attempt to move up, which is going to cost you. I personally do not want the Vikings to move up to 4. I think it would be giving up too much to try and move up to 4 to draft this tackle. With where you are at 14, we saw how much the 49ers had to give up to move from 12 to 3 with all expectations being them taking a quarterback. So I'm not interested in moving up to 4. My interest is if the Bengals do not take Sewell, if they don't draft the tackle for the future, instead they draft some sort of an offensive weapon, whether it be a wide receiver or whether Kyle Pitts, the tight end, falls to them and they take him as a player for them. If the Bengals don't take Sewell, I am interested in waiting to see what happens at pick 6 with the Dolphins and with pick 7 with the Lions. And if Sewell is still available at 8, I am interested in exploring what the options would be and moving up with Carolina now that it looks like they don't have that strong need to draft a quarterback. Would Carolina be more willing to discuss a trade back since they don't have that need? Probably. It looks like Darnold is going to be their starter, and they may not be interested now in drafting a quarterback at 8. So for me, there is more of the price is better to try moving to 8 than to try moving to 4. So I'm curious about that. The other possibility is waiting to see who Carolina takes and trying to move up to 9 with the Broncos, who you have a relationship with since their new GM came out of your organization. George Payton, the GM for the Broncos, was an assistant GM with the Vikings for an extended period of time. The problem with trying to move up with Denver is that Denver does have need at quarterback, and there is sort of every expectation that they're looking to draft whichever quarterback is still available at 9. So now there are questions with us still almost 3 weeks away from the draft. What sort of moving pieces will there be moving forward, and what is going to be happening on draft night? There have been a lot of trades in terms of draft pick trades pre-draft, this far ahead of the draft, that then have happened in recent memory, at least for me. And with these being high-end draft picks that have been moving around. So I'm curious. I am willing to explore the possibility of moving up to 8, trading with the Carolina Panthers, and figuring out some way at a lower cost to move up and try and draft a tackle. Whether that be Penei Sewell or whether that be the Northwestern tackle or the Virginia Tech tackle. If we have an expectation that one of those 3 or some high-end tackle who could play for you at left tackle is not available at 14, I would be interested in moving up, which is a thing the Vikings don't typically do, but I think the price of moving up to 9 or to 8 is more acceptable than trying to move all the way to 4. I also think it's more acceptable than trying to stay at 14 and hoping that someone falls to you. Because the other piece of this mock draft that PFF was doing earlier this week on YouTube is when you got to 14, it didn't seem like there were a ton of people available at that time who other teams would be interested in trading up to. The one lone possibility is if a quarterback falls out of the top 10, the teams in front of the Vikings right now, it doesn't seem like they would be interested in drafting a quarterback at this time, and it doesn't necessarily seem like the Vikings are interested in drafting a quarterback. But it does seem like the Patriots are interested in drafting a quarterback, one pick behind you at 15. So I think the only way the Vikings would trade back is if one of those quarterbacks is still available and someone behind you is interested in trading up with you to get one of those quarterbacks. Other than that situation, it doesn't seem like there are any picks where you would expect a team to want to move up to your position. This is similar to the Christian Ponder draft that we've discussed in a previous episode, where it seemed like the Vikings wanted to move out of the spot they were in, but couldn't find a trade partner. I think you might be looking at a similar situation. So for as many people who say they expect the Vikings to trade out of their pick and move back, I don't know that they're going to have a trade suitor who is interested in moving up to 14 with them. They may be stuck, if they stay at 14, just picking who they think is best suited to come into their team and play right now. So with everything we've just said, to try and sum up my position, I am interested if someone like Penei Sewell does not get drafted by the Bengals or the Dolphins or the Lions in trying to move up to 8, where it seems like there may be some draft flexibility now, and having less of a cost to move up. Part of the issue with trying to move up right now is you don't have a second-round pick. You traded that for Yannick Ngakoue last year, and that did not work out for you. So you don't have that second-round pick. You've got a couple of thirds now this year, and you have, of course, future draft capital, but the Vikings have not necessarily shown that they are always willing to move draft capital if it means they get less. So my interest is moving up somewhat, but not all the way to 4 if someone is available for you. And I'm interested in moving back, but I don't know that that is going to be an option with the players who are in this draft. So, with all of those things being said, it's always interesting to see when trades or moves that happen outside of your team sort of have an effect on you or could have an effect on you. This was one of those situations this week with the Sam Darnold trade, now with him heading down to Carolina. So that is everything I think that I was interested in talking about. The one last thing, I will touch on this here since I have this in my notes. There have been a lot of quarterback trades now, with Sam Darnold being the most recent, or quarterback moves, I should say, trades and free agent signings. So now we have a lot of teams who are going to have new starters at quarterback this coming season. And there was speculation this offseason that it could be as high as 16 different teams having new starting quarterbacks from where they were a year ago. At the moment, by my count, it looks like you're at 11 almost guaranteed new starters. Detroit and Los Angeles, who traded Jared Goff and Matt Stafford in between the two of them, you're looking at those two teams having a new quarterback this season from where they were opening day last year. The Jacksonville Jaguars are going to have a new quarterback. They're drafting one. The Jets now we know are going to be drafting a quarterback, and it's not going to be Sam Darnold with them, so that's 4. The Panthers now looks like they're moving off of Teddy and moving on to Darnold, so that's 5. The Saints, Drew Brees retired. The Bears, Trubisky signed with the Bills. The Texans, you have a ton of issues down there with their quarterback situation right now with the Deshaun Watson issues. The Colts, Phillip Rivers retired, and they traded for Carson Wentz, which on the other side of that, the Eagles now don't have Carson Wentz, and they will probably, it looks like, be starting Jalen Hurts. And then Washington, it seems completely cleared out their quarterback room, more or less, and brought in Ryan Fitzpatrick to be your opening day starter. So that, by my count, is 11 almost guaranteed new starters on opening day in terms of quarterbacks being in a different situation. We now also have a couple of possibilities. You're looking at the 49ers possibly having a different opening day starter. What with questions in the air now that they've traded up to 3, is Jimmy G still going to be there, or are you going to move on from Jimmy Garoppolo? It sounds like the price tag to get Jimmy Garoppolo is still pretty high right now, so we'll probably have to wait and see until draft day or possibly beyond whether Jimmy G is going to be in San Francisco and starting in San Francisco. And then the other question is Denver. Denver is the location that a lot of people have targeted in terms of where they think Teddy Bridgewater is going to end up. Teddy Bridgewater right now has contract issues where he would need to be expected to take a lower contract if he is to move and potentially compete for a starting job. And that said, we don't know whether Teddy Bridgewater will actually be starting or not. So that, with the 49ers and with the Broncos, would be 13 potential new starters at this point in the offseason. Now, there is always a possibility that someone else will have a different situation or scenario come up. I think at this point, we're definitely nearing the end of the quarterback carousel, as it were. So I don't think we're going to get to 16 different new starting quarterbacks, which is half the league, but we are at this point at a third and may potentially be moving as high as 40 or 45% of quarterbacks starting in a different position. As I say, yes, I did say the Bears with Andy Dalton coming in. Places that are more secure, you're looking at obviously everywhere else. I mean, places where other people have either re-signed. The re-signings that have happened or the questions that have happened were the Steelers. You're looking at Big Ben coming back. The Cowboys, you're looking at Dak Prescott with his new contract. The one other question I guess you could maybe say is in Seattle. Is the situation in Seattle settled with Russell Wilson, or could Seattle still potentially move on from Russell Wilson, try and move him somewhere, and then bring someone else in? That would affect 2 teams. I don't know which 2 teams that would be. It would be Seattle and someone else, probably, whether that's someone who's already on this list. I know the Bears made a trade offer, or at least it was reported that the Bears made a trade offer. So that, I think, is your one last flexible situation in terms of quarterbacking. And then the last thing I will say on this is with the Patriots, whether there's a lot of talk about them bringing Jimmy G back to New England, or whether the Patriots do end up drafting a quarterback. I don't know that they start ahead of Cam Newton on opening day. I think you're still looking at Cam Newton as your starter on opening day, the same as it was the situation last year. So that probably doesn't necessarily make a change. Now, I think obviously there are going to be changes in season. You're going to have quarterbacks who get hurt. We saw that happen with numerous quarterbacks last year. So there will be different starting quarterbacks at some point during the season. But in terms of opening day, by my count right now, you have 11 new starters, which in my mind are for sure, and then 2 possibilities of new starters. So, with all those things said, that is the end of our weekly wrap-up. We're going to move, as we have with the last couple of episodes, into looking at some former Vikings drafts. This week we will be looking at the 2016 and 2017 NFL drafts. We're going to go through these drafts. We're going to try to do some amateur evaluation of these drafts, see who the Vikings took, what's maybe their draft philosophy was, and see how many of these players are still with the Vikings. And that is coming up after the break here on the Eric the Red podcast. Hey everyone, this is the point in most podcasts where you would maybe expect to hear an ad read, a Patreon plug, or something of that nature. While that may be something that ends up being integrated into this podcast in the future, I'm more concerned at the moment with getting this podcast up and running. So, no ads, no Patreon, but if you do want to find out more about this podcast or any other project I'm involved in, head over to ericbeckmedia.com. That's ericbeckmedia, all one word, .com. Now back to the show. All right, and we are back here on the Eric the Red podcast, and as always, it has been a bit of a journey to try and get this screen recording happening on my end. So hopefully we are recording just fine, and we'll be able to get this up on the screen for those of you on YouTube. And as always, for those of you listening in podcast format, I will do my best to narrate everything that is happening and everything that we're seeing on screen. And let's go ahead and jump right into this. Now, I always feel whenever I have done this over the last couple weeks that I'm going to be so uber prepared going into this, and I do look over these before we start talking about them. But it's always a little bit of a journey as we actually do them interesting. I'm seeing new things even as I'm talking. So let's go ahead and dive right into this. It has been interesting to see over the last week or so that other media outlets have started to do their own sort of look backs at different past Vikings draft classes. That specifically I saw has started happening in The Athletic with Chad Graff from The Athletic. He's gone through a couple of these, so I don't think I could call it a scoop. I'm not being scooped. Obviously, this is what people are going to be doing moving into this draft, but I was here first. I've been doing this for a couple weeks. For what it's worth. Anyways, let's go ahead and start off here. We're going to be looking at the 2016 draft first, and I'm going to look back at the 2015 Vikings roster to see what maybe you were looking for going into the draft. Now, the thing I saw here that caught me off guard as we were starting this section is looking at the offensive line in 2015. All 5 of these guys started 16 games. Now, we can debate about how good each of these players are, but they all started 16 games, which is a surprise for me. I did not know we had that sort of stability at the time. So that, of course, was Matt Khalil, Brandon Fusco, Joe Berger, Mike Harris, TJ Clemmings on that line from left to right. TJ Clemmings is one of the guys we talked about last week. He was a rookie in 2015, drafted in the 2015 class. We knew at the time, or at least I'm going to say that we knew at the time, that this offensive line was not as good as other offensive lines we've had in Minnesota, even if they did all start all 16 games. So as we will continue to see, we're continuing to draft offensive linemen. I think this is sort of the starting point of the fan base starting to clamor for drafting better offensive linemen and being able to actually develop linemen as well as we possibly can, or to maybe even a higher standard than what we're actually seeing, or what we were actually seeing. So those are those positions. Looking elsewhere, we've got some different starters in our skill positions. Mike Wallace was a free agent signing. He came over. The other thing that I sometimes miss as we're talking about these draft classes in terms of need in the draft class is who we picked up in free agency the year before. That happened here with Mike Wallace. That happened earlier in the weeks that we've been discussing this with Linval and with some other players, some of these defensive backfield players. Looking at this roster, I understand why the fan base and why I felt pretty good about this roster at the time. 2015 is the year that we very dramatically and tragically lost to the Seahawks in the first round of the playoffs on a very cold day at TCF Bank Stadium on that missed kick. That maybe is the point when you're starting to say maybe we should be looking at specialists to draft. So that is a possibility for what you'd be looking at. Other possibilities, Sharif Floyd is still sort of developing at this point in time, but maybe you're looking defensive tackle. And then Zimmer, of course, is always looking at defensive backfield, or at least it seemed like it for the first 5, 6, 7 years of his time as the head coach here. And then I guess you're just sort of looking for depth. depth in terms of other places. You're maybe looking at tight end. You've got Kyle Rudolph at one side, but Rhett Ellison as your other tight end is definitely not going to be as good as a Kyle Rudolph. And some of us have our own opinions about how good Kyle Rudolph was or could have been. So those are the players on the 2015 team as you're going into 2016. So let's go ahead and pull up the 2016 draft and see what happens here. Now this is the draft. I did not remember, but as we're going through this, Vikings first draft pick this year. Oh, and we are too far behind. We'll go ahead and refresh this search function here. But this is the year that the Vikings decided they were going to look for a wide receiver. We're just going to have to click through on this. Vikings decided to look first round wide receiver, and they took Laquan Treadwell, 23rd overall. I did not know at the time, but I've heard more recently that there was an expectation that Laquan Treadwell was not going to be an immediate starter, but was going to be a project at wide receiver. What ended up happening throughout that season is that Treadwell almost didn't play at all in 2016. And it wasn't strange to start off because in 2015, you saw Stefon Diggs, who was a rookie. I believe that's correct. Let's click back here. Stefon Diggs was a rookie in 2015. He did not start playing until the fourth or fifth game that season. So it wasn't strange for the Vikings to hold out a wide receiver to continue to develop before they actually put him on the field. It was strange as time went on that Laquan Treadwell wasn't seeing the field at all. So we know now for sure that Laquan Treadwell was a very large bust for the Vikings. Treadwell did not pan out in any way, shape, or form. It took him years to even get a touchdown. Justin Jefferson has done more in 1 year than Treadwell did in 4 or 5 here in Minnesota. So when we look at this, my thing is always, who could we have taken other than the person we took in terms of figuring out who would have been the best player, 1, and is this person a bust, 2? Because had it worked out that Laquan Treadwell was the best available, it's hard to call him a bust. As it turns out, Laquan Treadwell was not the best wide receiver available. As we scroll down here, we see that Michael Thomas, who was drafted in the second round, 47th overall, almost a full round after you, was a much better and still is a much better wide receiver than Laquan Treadwell. This is a huge, huge miss. Not only did you miss badly on a skill position player who you hoped to do very well, you missed on a person who excelled above and beyond what your best expectations would have been. Michael Thomas has been a great wide receiver in the NFL and currently has the single-season receptions record. Now, there are the personality issues in terms of Michael Thomas. I know there's been some strife down there in New Orleans. There were questions about whether he would even remain on the New Orleans Saints team coming into this season. That said, Thomas as a player is a better player than Laquan Treadwell. Head, shoulders, knees, and toes above Laquan Treadwell. So that's a huge miss. That's a problem. Moving along to the Vikings' second pick, we see this here, second round, 54th overall. The Vikings take Mackenzie Alexander. In my notes, I just wrote next to Mackenzie Alexander, shrug emoji. I mean, he's fine. He developed into being a slot corner, even though he didn't necessarily want to be. He left the team for a year. Now he has come back to the Vikings. I mean, you could have found someone better. We see, as we scroll down here, there is a corner whose name I don't recognize, but who has been a Pro Bowler. So that, I think, is at least one way this person, James Bradbury, who went to Carolina, one way in which that person was better than Mackenzie Alexander. As it is, I don't have much of a problem with Mackenzie Alexander there. But I don't have strong feelings. Let's just leave it at that. I don't have strong feelings. I don't think this was a miss. I don't think this was a super hit. He just was a solid player and hopefully will continue to be a solid player moving forward. We do see here, though, in the third round, a name that we did not draft, Yannick Ngakoue, who played 6 games for the Vikings and led the team in sacks last year. So, yeah, you would have known, I guess, if you had taken Ngakoue at that point. We also see here Austin Hooper was drafted in the third round, tight end, was a Pro Bowler for the Falcons. That's maybe a guy, since you were potentially looking at tight end, and with the Vikings' seeming infatuation with tight ends, and with me continuing to remember the names of former tight ends for the Vikings, as a guy who maybe you could have taken in the second round. Moving down into the third round, the Vikings traded out of their pick. I have issues going back and forth about when the Vikings trade out of picks and when they don't. We're going to pull this up on the screen here. We're going to highlight this. The Vikings pick to trade here, they traded their third rounder to Miami in exchange for a sixth rounder in 2016, which is this year, and then a third and fourth round pick in 2017. I think this is a good trade. Now, one pick after that, we see the Bengals took Nick Vigil, who is now a Viking, so you could have taken him if you'd wanted to, I guess, at that point instead of trading. But for what you got on return there, I think that's a good trade. And there's not necessarily a ton in between that pick and where you picked in the fourth round that you necessarily missed out on. I see a couple of Gophers on this list here that you didn't take, but that is what it is. I'm infatuated with Gophers more than I should be because I love the University of Minnesota. So, Vikings, moving on to their fourth round pick, they select Willie Beavers, who is an offensive guard. This is a miss. Willie Beavers. How long did Willie Beavers play in Minnesota? This is another offensive line miss for the Vikings. In terms of who else you could have taken, I'm sure there are a bunch of people as we scroll down here that we could see. We see Dak Prescott, who you wouldn't have drafted at the time because you were expecting Teddy Bridgewater to be your guy to continue to develop. So Prescott is one of these guys who you missed on. You got Jordan Howard here who went to the Bears in between your picks. So you've got a couple guys there. Moving on to your fifth round pick, the Vikings take Kentrell Brothers, a linebacker. Brothers provided decent enough backup linebacking play for the Vikings for a couple of years. This is one of these guys, as I've mentioned before, having this sort of a 5-year rotation, sort of a cycle, continuing to draft people to come in and then sort of replacing them and having this 5-year rolling calendar, basically. Brothers, I think, fits into that. He's one of these guys who comes in as a backup for a while, and then you will cycle over to another backup moving forward. In terms of what you're getting in the fifth round, maybe you hope something else would have happened, especially since, 5 or 6 picks later, the Kansas City Chiefs take Tyreek Hill. So that's a miss. You would have rather had Tyreek Hill than Kentrell Brothers, especially since you decide in the sixth round with your first sixth round pick to take Moritz Boringer, who is a wide receiver from Germany. It would have been such a great story if Moritz Boringer had worked out in Minnesota. As it was, it did not work out. He ended up on the practice squad for a couple of seasons, and then I think went to the Bengals and was a practice squad tight end for a season, and then ultimately did not play a down in a regular season game, if I remember correctly. So, in terms of Moritz Boringer versus Tyreek Hill, I would rather have Tyreek Hill. Scrolling down here, we see another Vikings tight end with a name that I recognize from the past, David Morgan. David Morgan II, out of the University of Texas at San Antonio. David Morgan being the Vikings' second sixth-round pick in 2016. Another guy who just kind of was there, et cetera, et cetera. Moving on to the seventh round, we see here another Vikings draftee who has now left and returned to the team, Stephen Weatherly, who apparently was listed as a linebacker coming out of Vanderbilt and who has moved to defensive end as a pro. Stephen Weatherly, at this moment, I would expect to be in the position on the depth chart to be your starting right end. Whether you end up moving in a different direction and bringing someone else in here to start as your right end and having Weatherly as backup, that has yet to be seen this year. As it is, for a seventh-round pick, not a bad pick in my opinion. Moving right along. The Vikings' final pick in this draft, 7th round, 244th overall, J. Ron Curse, who provided safety backup help for you. and who maybe showed flashes occasionally of potentially becoming a starting safety, but that did not end up panning out. As it was, I don't have a huge problem with Jaron Kearse here. The Vikings have done worse, in my opinion, in the second or in the 7th round in different years. We're going to scroll down here to these notable undrafted players. There's one for the Vikings this year, and it is their current starting fullback, C.J. Ham. Gotta love me some C.J. Ham. I'm a big fan of fullbacks. C.J. Ham is one I like. Apparently, he doesn't actually grade out as an above-average fullback, or at least maybe he didn't last year, from whatever piece of information I saw within the last couple weeks. But I do love me some C.J. Ham, local-ish product. And looking at other... Is this Michael Pierce here? Michael Pierce, the current defensive tackle who will be starting after opting out, was an undrafted free agent for the Baltimore Ravens in 2016. I missed that my first time through this. So, Michael Pierce, guy we missed out on. We're going to see this as we move forward. I'm going to touch on this right now. One of, reportedly, Rick Spielman's reasons for loving 7th-round draft picks, just having sort of an abundance of 7th-round picks available, is so you can sign guys or you can draft guys rather than having to try and compete for them as undrafted free agents. I think we're going to have to wait until this 2017 draft, which we'll look at here in a minute. But you're going to start seeing the Vikings picking up guys as UDFAs, undrafted free agents, who are better or were better players than the guys they drafted in the 7th round. So my point is, if you want to hoard 7th round picks, you need to actually hit on them instead of finding better players as UDFAs than hoarding all these 7th round picks and not having those picks pan out. That is a philosophical draft issue, in my opinion, with this current regime. So, with all of that said, let's go ahead and click on here the full list of 2016 Minnesota Vikings draftees. Scroll down here. Going over the list, your first round pick was Laquan Treadwell. Second round, Mackenzie Alexander. Fourth, Willie Beavers. Fifth, Kentrell Brothers. Sixth round, Moritz Boehringer and David Morgan. Seventh round, Stephen Weatherly and Jaron Kearse. This, of the 3 Mike Zimmer, Rick Spielman drafts we've looked at so far, I think this is the worst so far. The only player there are 2 players there who turned into starters, Mackenzie Alexander and Stephen Weatherly. But they're not at the same level as a draft we looked at before. I believe it was 2011, when you had Kyle Rudolph, who may not necessarily have been a star in the NFL, but had more star power and had a higher level of play than either Mackenzie Alexander or Stephen Weatherly has shown they are capable of. So this looks like a draft where you did not hit on anyone necessarily, and you definitely missed big time on some people. Look at this. Laquan Treadwell's career stats: 71 receptions, 750 yards, 4 touchdowns. I'm pretty sure all of those were shattered by freaking Justin Jefferson last year. Even if the receptions were close. I mean, Justin Jefferson had 1,300 yards receiving last year. This is one of the worst misses that the Vikings have had, especially in the drafts we've looked at so far. Anywho, moving along, 2016, the ultimate end result for the 2016 Vikings was an 8-8 third-place finish in the division year, because this is the season, the off-season, I should say, when Teddy Bridgewater went down with his freak knee injury in practice. It also, looking at this, looks like you had Adrian Peterson issues here, and you didn't see Adrian Peterson. I don't remember if this is the Adrian Peterson off-field issues year or not, or whether he was hurt, and I'm not going to, at the moment, take the time to look. Sorry about that. But we see Jerick McKinnon is listed here as sort of the main starting running back for the Vikings in 2016. We do see with the wide receivers, you see Stephon Diggs starting to come into his own and Adam Thielen starting to come into his own. So you're starting to see actually good wide receiver play. You've got Kyle Rudolph there, at least being around for the entire season. And then we're starting to see big-time issues on the offensive line in terms of players not being able to stick around, not being able to play well at their position. None of the 5 offensive linemen in 2016 played an entire 16-game season. Moving to the defensive side of the ball in terms of the 2016 Vikings and what they might have been looking for in the 2017 draft, you've got Shamar Stephen starting at one of your defensive tackle spots, which they tried then, they tried last year. It's not working for me. You probably should have been looking for a defensive tackle. You still have consistent, I would say, linebacking play, even if you've got Greenway coming to the end of his career. You've got Kendricks and Barr sort of proving their worth. And then Terrence Newman is approaching the end of his career. So you've got Xavier Rhodes in the defensive backfield. You have Smith and Sendejo. I was never big on Sendejo, but you've got those two at safeties. And then you've got Mackenzie Alexander down here turning into a slot corner. So going into this, the Vikings, we will see what they were looking for. The expectation, I think, is that AP, Adrian Peterson, was out going into 2017. So you're looking for a running back. You're looking for offensive linemen, maybe defensive tackle, maybe defensive backfield, in my opinion. So let's go ahead and look at the 2017 NFL Draft. And I jumped the gun there with where the Wikipedia page was for those of you watching. But let's go ahead and take a look at the Vikings picks. The Vikings' first-round pick in 2017 was Sam Bradford. Vikings traded their 2017 first overall pick to the Eagles for Sam Bradford heading into the 2016 season. Sorry, they traded their 2017 pick, if I did not say that correctly, for Sam Bradford because they were in need of a quarterback and were looking to stay relevant, stay good, stay better than what might have happened if they had I think it was Sean Hill or someone of that nature, maybe Matt Cass, someone of that nature starting a quarterback instead of a more established starter. Now, had you not traded that pick, I'm going to play out a hypothetical that is dangerous. Had you not traded your first-round pick for Bradford, and had you played out the season with a platoon of backups, there is a very real chance that you have a very bad year and are trading closer to the top 10 than you maybe would have. We see here that the Eagles pick 14th with the Vikings' first overall pick if you're watching on YouTube. The Vikings could have ended up in the top 10, and this is the draft that saw Patrick Mahomes and Deshaun Watson come out. Strictly speaking for Deshaun Watson in terms of playing abilities, Deshaun Watson would have been a great option as a player. I will leave it at that. Even better than that would have been Patrick Mahomes, who Kansas City traded up to 10 to get. We will assume in this hypothetical universe that the Bears still screw up and take Mitchell Trubisky. But there is a possibility that you would have had Patrick Mahomes available to you had you not traded your first-round pick. Another player you would have had available to you and who I was almost willing to trade the draft for going into this was Christian McCaffrey, who got drafted 8th overall as a running back. The Vikings were looking for a running back. I became convinced that Christian McCaffrey was going to be a great running back, which he has turned out to be, although he has had just as many injury issues as the person we did end up taking, who was Dalvin Cook. This stinking search function foiled my plans. But the Vikings take Dalvin Cook as their first selection, drafted in the second round. They traded up a few picks to get him and take Dalvin Cook. Dalvin Cook was evaluated as a first-round talent who fell out of the first round because of off-the-field questions, but he has turned out to be a very solid, very good running back option for you. I'm going to make a very recklessly speculative statement here. I believe we here in Minnesota know how good the 2017 season was. 2017 is the year of the Minnesota Miracle or the Minneapolis Miracle, the year we lost to the Eagles in the NFC Championship game. My recklessly speculative point is, had Dalvin Cook not gotten hurt week 4 against the Lions, had Dalvin Cook played an entire season at the level we saw at the start of the season, I think the Vikings have a chance to go to the Super Bowl. I don't know that they necessarily win the Super Bowl, but I think they would have had a very good chance of making the Super Bowl had Dalvin Cook stayed healthy all year. That is my story. I'm sticking to that story, to that belief. Dalvin Cook was seemingly transcendentally good as a running back at the start of his career, those first 3.5 games. And it was a devastating injury to the Vikings. I think they do better if he stays healthy that season. Amazingly, a pick who will also be linked to the Vikings forever goes one pick after Dalvin Cook when the New Orleans Saints take Marcus Williams at safety, who, as Vikings fans know, is the safety who decided to try and go underneath Stephon Diggs to stop him, and instead saw Stephon Diggs run into the end zone for the Minneapolis Miracle. So a pick that will forever be linked to the Vikings, even though the Vikings had no influence on the pick itself. Moving right along in the third round here, we see the Vikings take Pat Elflein at center. I think Elflein had a decent enough rookie season at center. As it has turned out, Elflein did not continue to progress, and so Elflein doesn't even play for the Vikings anymore. He's on his third team already after spending a little bit of time with the Jets last year. He's down in Carolina. So that is an unfortunate miss. We see some names further down here, some skill position players, Chris Godwin, Kareem Hunt, and then Shaquille Griffin as a corner, who, since Zimmer loves his defensive backfield, maybe Shaq Griffin would have been a better fit eventually. At the time, I think the Pat Elflein draft is not the worst pick in the world. Looking back, it has not panned out. Continuing right along down here, we see some different trades that the Vikings made. And in the fourth round, the Vikings select Jaleel Johnson at defensive tackle. This is a pick that has not panned out as well as you would have liked. He has provided decent enough depth, but never developed into a starter. We can say the same thing about their second to fourth round selection in Ben Gedeon. Nick Vigil is the new Ben Gedeon on this roster. Ben Gedeon sort of was your starting 4-3 linebacker who ended up not continuing as sort of at the same level that an Anthony Barr or an Eric Kendricks ascended to. Continuing right along, we see a whole lot more trades. The Vikings were busy with trades this season. And scrolling down to the fifth round, we see the Vikings take Rodney Adams as a wide receiver, who I think they kind of hoped would be a return specialist guy, since they ended up getting rid of or not bringing Cordero Patterson back. Rodney Adams didn't pan out. Continuing down, Danny Isadora as a guard the Vikings draft in the fifth round. Didn't pan out. Continuing further, Bucky Hodges, another tight end that the Vikings took. Didn't pan out. This one, I think we skipped a couple of people here. Or maybe not. Let's take a look. In any case, one person you didn't draft was Xavier Woods, who is now with your team. So that was a player who is now here that you could have drafted. But if I am remembering correctly, let's go ahead and scroll back up here a little bit. A tight end who you didn't take, and I indeed was correct, earlier in the fifth round, a tight end who was available, a guy by the name of George Kittle. Wouldn't it have been nice to have George Kittle opposite your guy, Kyle Rudolph? A guy who, if George Kittle had been drafted by your team, is probably still on your team right now, and who turned into a very, very good player for the 49ers. That's a pick you maybe would have taken other than Ben Gedeon or Jaleel Johnson in the fourth round. Or if you had not traded out of one of these positions, which you ended up trading out of in the fourth round, maybe you take George Kittle instead. As it was, we'll keep scrolling down here. You take Bucky Hodges in the sixth round. And continuing on to the seventh round, we see two picks back-to-back for the Vikings. Stacey Coley, another wide receiver. Afadi Odenigbo, who I have liked with his defensive line depth and who was pushed into a starting role and did not quite fulfill or live up to that expectation this past season, and now is no longer with the team. But I liked Ifeadi Odenigbo well enough to be a 7th-round pick. And then it looks like we've got even 2 more picks. My gosh, I was right. This 2017 draft is the year of hoarding 7th-round picks. Elijah Lee, a linebacker, name I don't remember. Jack Tocho, cornerback out of North Carolina State. Another guy who did not end up panning out. And then we'll scroll down here to our undrafted free agents, and once again we see a name here, a guy by the name of Eric Wilson, a guy who we talked about at the top of this, a guy who you found as an undrafted free agent who you did not use one of your 4 7th-round picks on. So, like I said, if you are going to hoard 7th-round picks and then miss on guys who you take as undrafted free agents, why are you hoarding 7th-round picks? Other guys you missed out on in undrafted free agency: Taysom Hill, a quarterback; Young Ho Koo, who I will admit was not immediately a great kicker, who developed into a better kicker. It took him a little bit of time, but that's a guy you missed on. And then there are a couple of other names, if you were to go through this list, who, with one of your 4 7th-round draft selections, would have been a better option than someone you actually ended up taking. So, as we come to the end of this, we'll take a look here and recap the entire 2017 draft for the Vikings. Did they take 10 players? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Vikings drafted 11 players in 2017. Your list: 2nd rounder, Dalvin Cook; 3rd round, Pat Elflein; 4th round, Jaleel Johnson and Ben Gedeon; 5th round, Rodney Adams and Danny Isidora; 6th round, Bucky Hodges; 7th round, Stacy Coley, Ifeadi Odenigbo, Elijah Lee, and Jack Tocho, or possibly Tocho, or even something different that I am not aware of. Obviously, your best pick in this draft is Dalvin Cook. Dalvin Cook continues to play at a good, high level. Unfortunately for your team, he has not consistently stayed healthy enough to play all 16 games for you. So as good as he has been, he still has some durability questions around his play, especially when you are focusing on being a run-first offense. But then you see a lot of guys here who end up being misses. Pat Elflein, decent for a year, ultimately a miss. Jaleel Johnson, decent enough backup, ultimately a miss. You see guys here who didn't even end up playing for you, even hardly at all. So, Bucky, how do I remember the name Bucky Hodges and he didn't even play for you? Oh my goodness. Well, this has been a somewhat frustrating day of looking back at drafts. I don't know whether it's going to get better or worse as we move along. But as we see here, your 2 best picks in terms of 2016 and 2017, we've got Dalvin Cook from the 2017 draft, and then I guess Mackenzie Alexander from the 2016 draft. This is where, when I hear about how good of a draft expert, if you will, Rick Spielman is, you look at he has a way of drafting a lot of players, but it's guys who just don't end up developing as well as you would hope, especially as we're looking at the 2016 and 2017 drafts. So ultimately, I think as I was reading through one of these Chad Graff articles that I mentioned earlier with him looking at the draft, as I'm going to exit out of this and just come back to my face for those of you watching on YouTube. Chad Graff said that the 2015 draft is probably the one that is recognized as the best of the Mike Zimmer head coaching in Minnesota era. So far, I'd have to agree with that. And if that is the case, we're going to be in for a whole lot of fun coming up in the next 2 weeks. So expectations moving forward as we continue to review the drafts from the past. We will be looking at 2018 and 2019 next week, and then in the week leading up to the draft, we will be looking at 2020, and then doing some sort of recap of the entire Mike Zimmer drafting era. The entire Mike Zimmer drafting era as we stand at the moment. It is going to start to get a little harder as well to fully determine how well a draft class can be graded because these players just have been playing for a shorter amount of time. When we get to 2020, I'm pretty sure we're going to say that Justin Jefferson was a great pick and is hopefully going to be an excellent player in the NFL moving forward. We will certainly have to wait to see how his career plays out. But we will be seeing less results just in terms of less playing time as we move forward. That said, we will continue to monitor in terms of the draft capital that we spent, who did we take, what sort of was the philosophy around that point, and hopefully give ourselves some sort of understanding of what the Vikings might be looking to do as we head into this 2021 draft, which, as we said last week, will be happening on April 29th. So as we record here on the 10th, we're 19 short days away from the start of the 2021 NFL draft, and I'm continuing to get pumped, especially as more moves continue to be made. I cannot wait for draft night. Apparently, this draft is actually going to have in-person experiences rather than the fully online or virtual draft that we saw last season. So it will be interesting to see. I believe they're doing that in Cleveland. It'll be interesting to see what happens in Cleveland this year, how many players actually go to the draft. But that is all things that we will continue to discuss in future episodes of the Eric the Red podcast. Thank you, those of you watching on YouTube, for watching. And for those of you listening on your podcast players, thank you for listening. My name is Eric Beck, and as I said, this has been the Eric the Red podcast.